From the Temple in Independence, Missouri, welcome back to CIMM Sessions, little bite-sized servings of theology, culture, and community of Christ, identity, mission, message, and beliefs and practices. I'm David Lloyd, the director of CIMM. Welcome again to tonight's third part of our series of people, politics, and discipleship. And we should put peacemaking in there also, because tonight we have as our special presenter Sandee Gamet. Most of you will know her from years of service to the World Church in regard to peacemaking and conflict resolution and many other resources that we're blessed to have in the church. A little bit of housekeeping before we get started here. First of all, remember, if you have any questions for Sandee during the presentation, go ahead and open up your chat box, and it's down below here. It says chat on it, and enter a question, and by the end of this session, we'll have a chance to answer a few of the questions, and we'll try to get to as many as possible by the end of the experience. Also coming up on our schedule is after tonight, we'll be meeting again next Wednesday, October 30th, for Tony and Charmaine Chavalis-Smith, talking about listening with a lectionary, and we're going to be talking about December and January. So all of you people who have services that are taking place during Advent, this would be a great opportunity for you to hear from them about how we can exegete those scriptures for those 2 months and help us through understanding what the lectionary is telling us. So we've been talking in the last 3 weeks about politics. Not that it's important topic right around now. As we're recording this, we're only days away from an election in the United States, but this also has wide-reaching application to all our countries that are represented in the church, as we understand what politics has to do with our theology and how we process through people who have differing opinions from us. And tonight especially, we're going to be talking with Sandee about living peacefully in a divided political world. And so welcome tonight, Sandee. I'm glad to see you with us. Back in the United States again. I lost track of her there in Europe for a while, and it's great to have you along tonight. And go ahead and share with us.
Great. So the things I'm going to share tonight apply to politics, but also to any topic that is divisive. So it has hopefully a broad application for you as you engage. And the question is, why is it so difficult to engage in those kinds of topics with somebody else? So hopefully some of the things I share with you will give you a sense of kind of what's going on when we have those conversations, and some ideas about how you might engage more effectively. So I have a couple of books that have been very, very helpful to me and informative. They're not big, they're not hard to read. Well, at least the first one's not. And the first one I want to share with you is called Difficult Conversations by Katie Day. And Dave's going to put that in chat. Difficult Conversations, Taking Risks, Acting with Integrity. And you can tell it's not a very big book. And it has really been insightful for me in regard to the conversations we can get involved in. So in her book, at the beginning, she quotes an author, Robert Putnam, and from a book that he wrote called Bowling Alone. And one of the concepts that he shares is that there is a decline in social capital over the last 40 to 50 years. So he defines social capital as the ways people develop connections. So if we think about today's world, there are less people joining clubs. We don't go to each other's homes after church like some of us grew up doing. People are reducing their attendance in churches. We don't write letters any longer. And you can think about all of the different ways in which, if you think in the past, some of us can think 40 and 50 years ago. Those of you who can't, you've heard stories that the neighborliness, the community sense that many places in the world experience simply isn't present as it once was. And so, and then we had the pandemic where everybody had to be inside their own little bubble with very few outside connections. And so we're also, I think, working our way out of that dilemma in our society. We spend a lot of time on our computers and streaming. And so a lot of what we're doing now is in our homes and not outside with connections with lots of different people. And it's those connections that, because we're losing those connections, that we're also have diminished our social capital. Social capital is really important when it comes to engaging in conversations like we're talking about. So there are a couple of things that we want to think about. One is trust. So with diminishing social capital, trust also diminishes. And when we are less trusting, having difficult conversations is also difficult. Trust plays in a really, really important foundation to being able to engage with someone who has a differing point of view, particularly if it's a strongly differing point of view than what we might have. So Putnam goes on to talk about concepts of thin and thick trust. And I found this to be very interesting because I've experienced thin trust in congregations where I thought there was thick trust. And I think you can think probably about some situations that you may have encountered yourself where, in fact, you thought you had thick trust, but when you got into a more intense or discussion in which you had very different points of view, you may have found yourself crashing through that thin trust. Just like when we go out on thinking the lake has, you know, a good solid ice mass and you walk on it and you find it cracking and you fall through that thin crust that you thought was a thick ice. And that happens to us within the congregation life. It happens with friends. It happens in other places. Thin trust is really what we have societally with acquaintances. So those people who we don't know well, who are casual acquaintances, and we think we have some basic trust there, but we may find that it's thin, and it in thick trust. When we get to thick trust, that means that it's really a solid sense of relationship here. But it takes time. It takes time to develop thick trust. And let's see, are you seeing a line here in my slide, David?
No, I'm not seeing a line.
Screen. Okay, good. You're seeing all the words then.
Okay.
So in thick trust, we recognize and accept the fact that we have differences and we're able to engage. And I imagine you can think of relationships in which you would say you have thin trust and you probably would not move towards a religious topic or a political topic in which you sense that perhaps it wasn't safe to go there to have a good conversation or to share your point of view that could be different. And you probably can think of relationships that you have thick trust. When you have thick trust, you can have those conversations, and the person won't walk away, or you won't become estranged. So I think knowing what sort of trust I'm engaging, what level of trust I'm engaging in, I think is helpful as we try to determine how we enter into conversations such as these. So did you recognize places where you might have thin trust or thick trust? Okay. So another quote that I'd like to share with you from her book is this one that I have here. Sociological data and common sense tell us that trust happens when people are brought together and given opportunity to engage each other. And that's a really, really important concept. If we don't have opportunities to simply build relationships, then these conversations that are divisive are going to be very difficult to engage in, because that level of trust is thin and easily broken. So we need to create these opportunities. And of course, we're not going to do it in the next few days before the election. So a lot of what I'm sharing here is hopefully going to be helpful as you engage in the next election or the next religious controversial conversation. And there are many of them that are out there in our world today. And it's all over the world. United States is not the only place that has conversations that are divisive about what people are engaging in socially in their lives. So creating those opportunities are imperative. And here's the thing you need to think about is, don't take the most difficult, most divisive topic to start with, because you're already headed toward a really difficult encounter, particularly if you don't know this person well enough to gauge whether or not what kind of level of trust you're working on. So start with lesser divisive topics, because that creates safety. If I know I can have this topic that's really very low level divisiveness, but we have different points of view and we can engage successfully, then that means that maybe the next conversation that's a level more means that we can successfully engage there. So you've got to develop the relationships, and you need to go gradually into the really hard topics. So those are just things to think about as you begin to consider engaging in these things. I'd like to share a story from a Sunday school class that I was leading in the last year in my congregation. And in my congregation, we had a variety of points of view on the material that we were studying. And one particular person began to recognize that they had a minority point of view. And I think we're beginning to feel uncomfortable, because at one point, this person said, well, I probably shouldn't say anymore, because, I think maybe, he didn't quite finish, but was clearly worried that it wouldn't be accepted, and that he needed to just kind of diminish his participation. So as the facilitator of the class, I said, no, it's really important to hear your point of view. Having different points of view is really important. The rest of the Sunday school class nodded in agreement, which meant that the group was open to hear the other point of view that he held. And that created a point of safety. And so this person began to engage again in the class and stayed, didn't leave, didn't go to some other class that they would feel safer in. So people need to know that it's safe to their point of view. If it's different, is safe to engage with it, which means that our reception of that point of view is open and accepting. We don't have to have the same point of view to do that. So there are two basic ways that we come to a conversations, at least from my experience. We come to a conversation, a discussion about a topic that we're aware has different points of view. We're open, no agenda. Or we come to it in a debate mode. Now, some people love to debate. They like to get in there and they like to push back. But if we think about debate, it's about convincing, persuading, and winning. So I think when you begin to think about engaging in divisive political conversations, religious topics in which persons have strong differing points of view, societal issues, you need to think about what you're coming into that conversation with. How are you moving into it? If you're coming in to debate, then your partner in that conversation or others may not wish to have a debate at all. And then a couple of things can happen. It becomes intense. People become very defensive. They are defending their point of view, their opinion, and then debate causes people to close. So I'm not going to be open to David's point of view if all David's interested in is winning me over, convincing me, and trying to find all my weak points. So now I'm busy protecting my point of view rather than being open to that exploration of what points of view can do when they come together. So you really need to think about what it is. What do you come with? How is it that you're going to planning on engaging? And if it's a debate mode, then you need to be ready for the result of it. Because as we've seen on some of the debates that have been publicized during this election time, they haven't been particularly helpful, I think, for many people who want to really sincerely determine who they want to support. So another book that I'd like to share with you is called On Dialogue, and the author is David Bohm. This book has also been so insightful. David Bohm is a renowned physicist. Now, I was not a good math or science person, never have been. And so when I considered reading this book, it's not very big, so it's just a thin book. Reading a book by a physicist, I had some doubts about what I was wading into. But he is so insightful on the studies that he has done. He's no longer with us. He passed away a few years ago. And it was particularly insightful to some of the experiences that we had in developing listening circles and leading listening circles in the church. So one of the things that he says is, if each one of us can give full attention to what is actually blocking communication, while she or he is also attending properly to the content of what is communicated, then we may be able to create something new between us. And, I still have to read that a number of times to really grapple with that concept. If each one of us can give full attention to what is actually blocking communication, while she or he is actually attending properly to the content of what is communicated, then we may be able to create something new between us. I think that's a fascinating concept. So from my point of view, when Bohm talks about dialogue, I see it as pure dialogue. So we use the word dialogue a lot of times in which I would consider it to be a discussion, back and forth, sometimes rapid fire, sometimes interrupting each other, discussion. Dialogue is much more focused opportunity for communicating and experiencing some of the concepts I'm going to share here in a minute. So in dialogue, as well as in the listening circles that we brought to the church, we're not deciding anything. We're not coming to any conclusion. And it encourages us to be open and free. So if you think about having a discussion about a political issue that's divisive, you're not going to probably solve the national dilemma of wherever you live in when you have this conversation. So you're not going to be deciding anything. And the conclusion you come to, if it's determining what party you might support, might be for you personally, but it's not going to be a group conclusion. And what you want to have your engagement be is open and free and safe. So here are some points that I'd like you to consider as you think about engaging. Before you begin to engage, I think that's really helpful to think about how and where did I develop my point of view? Where did it come from? What life experience shaped my point of view? Our points of view do not come out of the thin air. They may come from conversations that we heard our parents talk about when we were young, and those conversations continued through us in our developing years, and impacted how we view things. It may come from a personal life experience as an adult, something that occurred for us, or several life experiences, something that we have read that we have really internalized. So life experiences are important for us to know about how we got to the point that we're talking about. Fact versus fact. If I'm sharing a fact and someone else is sharing a fact, there's no personal connection. I'm just pushing my fact out, and their fact is pushing back out. And it doesn't allow for empathy to develop. Facts against facts don't provide opportunities for empathy. And empathy is what helps us kind of step in the shoes of the other and understand, oh, that's how they got to that point of view. That's what's occurred in their life, and that's why they've come to this conclusion. But fact on fact often leads to debate, because you're trying to make your fact stand more solidly than the other person's facts. So a question that I would encourage you to think about is, what would happen to me if I changed my opinion in any way? If we hold on tight to those facts as being the truths that are the only truths, what if I decided that there was something I heard and I would change my opinion? What would that do to me personally? So I think that's an important question, because what it does is now it leads me to a couple of other concepts. And as I said before, with this quote, the key to having these opportunities for considering what's blocking the conversation while still being attentive to what's being said is the opportunity to have those engagements. So the first thing I'd like to talk about is suspending assumptions. So I know that we all know about assumptions, and we've all engaged in assumptions. Sometimes they've been accurate, but oftentimes not. And so everyone comes with their assumptions to any conversation we're having, whatever the topic is. So Bohm is saying that we should neither carry out the assumption, in other words, act on, presuming our assumption is accurate, act on it, nor should we suppress it. In other words, oh, I can't think about that. That shouldn't be what I'm thinking. That's not assumption I should hold. That's not helpful either. So what he suggests, and I'm not saying this is easy, I think this is a real challenge, is to take our assumptions and put it out in front of us and have a look at it. So, how do we do that? We kind of have to name our assumption for ourselves, or the assumption that we're having about the others that we're engaged with, and have a look at it outside of ourselves. What's going on? Why did I have that assumption? And how am I reacting to it? And then how does it become an opening to our conversation? So the point is to keep the dialogue at a level where the opinions come out, but where you can look at them. I think that's a challenging concept. Suspending our assumptions. Stand back and observe myself and my thoughts. That's key to what Bohm would suggest that we need to do when it comes to engaging effectively in dialogue. Identity is the next thing. Identity and our opinions. When our opinion becomes our identity, we're not open to discussion because it's threatening. And having someone else engage us with a differing point of view than what my identity is attached to, that we're busy defending not a point of view, we're defending our identity, something very core to us. When I lived in the Quad Cities, some of you may have heard this story, we became involved in the mediation center that was developed there. We became involved in helping bring small groups together for pro-life, pro-choice conversations. The Women's Health Clinic was wanting to build a health clinic in the Quad Cities, and they knew that this could be this was in the 90s, so it was very explosive, and there were violent things that could occur because of the differing points of view. And so we were asked to help engage people in dialogue, pro-life and pro-choice individuals, in order for there to be a sense of can we hear each other in the midst of what possibly is coming to the Quad Cities. What we discovered was that persons who were in the extreme end of the negative, what was considered not, so opposing women's clinic, which would offer abortion and other women's health concerns in that regard, would not come to the conversations. And our sense is that they would not come to the conversation. They would be groups of four, two pro-life, two pro-choice. Because if they engaged with someone who was pro-choice, then it would be the same as giving up their point of view. So they wouldn't engage. So their identity was wrapped up in being pro-life supporters. And so they would refuse to engage in those kinds of conversations. Now, as we tried to figure out how we might draw in these extremes, and there were, of course, extremes on the pro-choice who had no interest in hearing any other point of view because they believed they were right. So they were more likely to engage than the pro-life on the extreme ends. We began to develop conversations around the idea of adoption. That was something that the pro-life individuals could support, and the pro-choice. Now they supported it in different ways, but their identity was not trapped in the issue of adoption. And we did have some of the extreme persons with holding more extreme points of view come into dialogue and conversations. So I think it's important for us to think about, is my identity attached to my point of view? It's not a healthy place to be because we can't engage in anything that might cause us to have to change anything in our point of view, because it's attacking who I am internally. So once again, I think it's a good question to ask ourselves, what would happen to me if I changed my opinion in any way? And for those who identity is attached, they simply would say that they couldn't exist. They just couldn't go there. So that brings us then to the next point, and that's the impulse of necessity. And I found this one really resident in our congregational, our church life. So necessity in Bohm is defined as something I won't yield from, cannot be turned aside. So it must exist. And he says necessity is one of the most powerful forces. It overrides all instincts eventually. All serious arguments in families or dialogue are about different views of what is absolutely necessary. I want you to think about the changes that the church has engaged in over the years. I believe, this is my opinion, that when there were some changes that the church engaged in, church name, women in the priesthood, we could just name them, that there were individuals whose identity was so linked with those. I mean, the first books that came out about Nauvoo changed the way we view Joseph Smith Jr. and the Nauvoo experience. People had so identified with that as being them, they could not tolerate to exist any longer in the institution. And I think that is that necessity. It's absolutely was absolutely necessary that the church maintain its name as it was, that women did not participate in priesthood offices, an absolute necessity. And the change just simply couldn't be tolerated. And the only option for some was to leave the church as it was, then change into it. So I've probably given you a lot of things that are to think about, but I do have some ideas about what we can do to to help ourselves when we want to engage with civility. What can we do? And I've mentioned some of these already. Be mindful of our intentions. Are we coming into this fully open, curious, willing to hear this other point of view? Because we want to learn, how did this person get there with this point of view? It surprises me they hold this point of view. How did they get there? What makes sense to them? We don't ask why questions. If you think about being at home when you were a kid and your parents asked you why, was that a question that you willingly answered, or did you think it was a trap because you were going to get punished depending on how you answered it? So why questions aren't helpful when we're trying to engage. So that mindfulness of being open means that we have to be careful how we approach, how we want to hear more information. So I just like to hear more. Or, wow, can you say how you got there? But 3 why questions in a row, statistics say that the person will just simply stop, engaging further. And that's about adults as well as kids. So mindful of our intentions. Are we going to do we love debating? Are we gearing up for the energy that gives us? Did this other person know that? Gain skills. So that's really important. If we have skills, good communication skills, if we know how to listen without judgment, with truly taking in what the other person has to say, that's a really important skill when it comes to engaging with these really tough topics. Develop relationships beyond difficult topics. If you really want to engage with people, you need to develop that thick trust, which means that you need to develop relationships. You need to do something. If you're only going to engage with these individuals about tough topics that are political, you can imagine that it'll probably be a debate. If that's not what you're looking to engage in, then developing those relationships so that it deepens your trust, so that you have thick trust, then that's going to be really, really important. I already mentioned, start at a lower level of differences. Don't engage in the most difficult political, religious, divisive topic that you can think of in order to have the kind of conversation you want. Start with something that's a lower level so that safety can be experienced, trust can develop in how you want to engage. You develop trust with the other person and how they want to engage. As we said, suspend assumptions. Willingness to explore and share your assumptions. So be vulnerable. You have to be vulnerable and share, well, this is my assumption. It might be about the other person's point of view. You might be suddenly realizing that you have had this conversation, assuming some things about your own self and your own point of view. And then asking yourself, is it absolutely necessary? And if you say, yes, I cannot, I would be nothing, or if I would leave the country, if it's absolutely necessary, that's something you need to know as you engage. So here are a couple of helpful attitudes. Non-judgmental curiosity. So you notice it's non-judgmental. We can be curious, but we can also have a whole lot of judgments going on in our head about what's going, what are we going to hear, or how we feel about what we think we're going to hear. So it needs to be non-judgmental curiosity. And a willingness to share life experiences. That does cause us to be vulnerable. But that's really where some of the most amazing conversations by people have occurred, is when they've shared their life experiences and the other person all of a sudden had a whole new sense and appreciation for how the other person came to their point of view, even though it's very different. Then the skill of listening and reflecting back what you understand. And I know that there's a whole lot of you on this phone call who know about paraphrasing, reflecting back. But it's the only way that that other person can be guaranteed that you got it and that you weren't laying a whole lot of assumptions on what they said and then paraphrasing back your assumptions. So staying right with what the person has told you as best you can, so that they have a chance to know that you really got them. And also, if you missed the mark, they have a chance to clarify for you so that you've truly understood their point of view. And you can ask the same for yourself of them if they don't automatically do it. So there you have it. For the things that I have gleaned over the years and the work that we have done and the various kinds of ways of engaging in things that are difficult and pleasant to be able to engage in. So, David.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sandee. Again, if any of you have questions for Sandee tonight, go ahead and put them in the question box or chat box. So this has really got me thinking in so many different directions, Sandee, especially from how we create and maintain our identities, and when do we come up against something greater than where we've chosen to plant our feet. And I would argue, it comes with Jesus and the kingdom of God, compared to what other identities I have. So case in point, for me, I am a rabid Disney fan because I love the stories of Disney. I love storytelling. I think it gets across messages that we can't do in a sermon very well, and yet we love to sit around the campfire and have these conversations. So Disney has always been a very important part of my life. And I even did a show for the Travel Channel about Disney World and things like that. So I'm vested into it. And then Disney does this thing with one of their passes. Used to be free, that was given out to spread people out through the park and make things less crowded. And then they started adding price ranges to those passes to get into the lightning lanes of their rides. And soon it became a thing that only rich people could afford, and there became a classism at the park. The people who could afford these passes and get on every ride that they want to, and the poor blokes like me who basically, had to spent most of our time getting the money just to get there in the first place. And I was confronted with an identity I had and the kingdom of God. And it made me release my hold a little bit on Disney, because I recognized that this kingdom of God thing that I talk about is more important than this. And so I think a lot of times we tend to hold on to these identities as a part of ourselves, and when we're confronted with Jesus, sometimes we have to have our fingers pried off. And I can think in history in my life of the many things that I've had to rethink in regard to theology and stands that we have taken to be able to say in a prophetic church, we can't ever hold on tightly to anything because in the nature of God and our own understanding, we're finding new things all the time. And so I think this goes along with what we're talking about here politically too. You know, can we can we release our political affiliation enough to talk about the kingdom of God? And I see that a lot when you're talking about the identity nature. Can you comment a little bit more on that and how we might live that out a little bit better in the church?
Well, I think that if we think about the various religious denominations, when people are part of a denomination and that denomination is everything that they see themselves as, and they have a conversation with another denomination that's diametrically different or opposed, I I think that's really tough, David, because we're talking about two people who have interpreted Jesus and the
Mm-hmm.
gospel in
Mm-hmm.
very different ways and who are convicted that this is what Christianity is, and I am a Christian. So you had the capacity to be able to say Disney is not all it was to me, and now I am going to have to renegotiate my sense of place with Disney. But when we are so convicted that I, as a Christian, and this is it, I think we have to know that the conversation is probably, they either will be willing to listen to us, and you will just simply have a sharing, which is wonderful. And you never know what sharing is going to, kind of niggle at someone. But there won't be any sort of, there probably is going to be one person who's trying to convince the other that their view of Christianity is the only form, because this is the Jesus that is.
Right.
So I'm not sure I have, I think about people that I have known who have had a job their entire lives that was important to them. And when they were either let go from that job or they retired, they said,
Yes.
don't know who I am.
Right.
Their entire life was unknown then. And that can be that's devastating. It also can put a person into a limbo they don't know how to climb out of.
Yeah.
And so I think what we're talking about is people who have interpreted Jesus in a very certain way, the gospel in a certain way, that for them to have it switched or to it's just too threatening. They can't do it. It would destroy their world of who they see they are. So identity is really, really, I think we have to be very careful that we don't put our point of view and beliefs and say that is our identity. I think that's a dangerous one.
Right. And I think that definitely is an inward question for all of us is, okay, where am I holding on to something needlessly? And not necessarily, for instance, well, we have been taught, some of us have been taught, those of us older have been taught to have an answer prepared for why we are a part of this faith.
Mhm.
to have your list made up of, if someone comes up and confronts my faith, I'm going to be able to lay out a whole plan here and anticipate what they're going to say so I can counteract it and have this not dialogue but this argument with each other. And instead of saying just arbitrarily, I really appreciate the Amish for what they do in regard to peacemaking and their simple lifestyle. I'm never going to live that way personally, but I can appreciate it. So I can come together in that appreciation and be able to have a meaningful relationship and dialogue with these people if I allow my opinion of who I am down enough to be able to have that kingdom of God relationship with someone from outside of my denomination and or not in a denomination. So I think that's really helpful as we look inwardly at ourselves as to why we feel the need to fight, and we're trained to fight, and how we've now come into this church where dialogue and thin or thick trust is going to be the mainstay of our survival into the future.
Yeah, good point.
We got a question here from Sandra Hunt. So often we find ourselves drawn into a difficult conversation. Do we respond even though we feel inadequate to do so, or retreat?
I think you have an easy option there, and that is to listen. So if you initiate the listening, Sandra, if you initiate hearing what the other person is saying, what their point of view is, and clearly you're open, you're doing an authentic job of trying to understand, you're not putting in your own point of view, you're simply staying with them. You may have to do it several times, but it can transform the interaction. And your engagement may feel more comfortable because they feel like they've been listened to. They don't feel like they have to pound on you in order to get you to get them, to understand them. Doesn't mean you agree with them, but it's amazing how it can change the dynamic if you're the one who initiates the good listening skills of just hearing them, restating, to the best of your ability to capture what they've said. So,
yeah, in teaching the priesthood classes, there's one I think in the intro to priesthood listing of attributes that people have for ministers, and one of the number one things always is I felt listened to. And so all of us as ministers can remember that as a very important part of what we do. Susan Trimble asks, any recommended resources for listening circles? Listening circles.
yes, listening circles. I love listening circles. Yes, just contact me. We have people who have gone through the listening circle facilitator training. It's been 18 years ago now.
Oh, yes. Oh my gosh, no.
Whew.
Got a
But
book up here somewhere on that.
who have gone through the facilitator training, and I'm glad to help any group that wants to develop a dialogue. We might not call it listening circles. We might want to just call it dialogue groups or whatever. But I'm glad to help people find whatever it is that they're wanting to engage and find the process that works best for how they want to engage. And listening circles or dialogue circles are a great tool.
Very good. Michael asks this question. Rather than dialogue where you try to convert people, I find it better to dialogue about how we can address social problems together, which is a form of love to the neighbor. Then both can hang in to who they are. I meant to hang on to hang on to who they are.
Yeah, I think you meant rather than debate, you want to dialogue. I think that was probably a mistype.
Yeah.
But yeah, and there are different ways, different reasons for dialoguing. So in other words, if we're talking about a political conversation about politics, like I said, you're not going to be probably solving the national issues, but you might be dialoguing in terms of having next steps in neighborhood issues or in a small community. So but you start out with just the pure listening, and then that is a separate stage when you go into decision making next steps. That's a whole another separate stage. So you want to make sure your dialogue is not sidetracked into, because we as human beings so want to just fix it and move on. But dialogue doesn't do that if you're going to really dialogue. So spend the time dialoguing without any agenda. And if your dialogue has been really done well, you will naturally know where to go from there into step number 2, which would be decision making next steps. But pure dialogue never makes that step number 2. So you need to be clear with the people that you're working with, how you're going to step your process and what steps you're going to engage in and what they mean.
And as a closing question here, Gwendolyn Blue says, just an observation, after this election, I believe we may benefit from your helpful attitudes and engaging in civil conversation. I believe healing will be needed at that time also.
Yeah, I think like so many things that are divisive, the group that is not found to have their preferred choice chosen, then if we're not careful, those who did not get their choice can feel disenfranchised and alienated.
Retreat further from, yeah. Well, thank you again, Sandee, for your insight, and hopefully we can figure ways of applying this personally to ourselves, as well as how we present the gospel message in the congregations in which we serve, that focus on the kingdom of God rather than the political parties that are bombarding our televisions and my phone right now. That as I've sat here, yes, I've gotten some spam messages, but it's a difficult time, and a lot of people are hurting, and the church is a great place where we can bring about healing. Thank you again, Sandee, and thank you everyone who has joined us tonight. Join us again Wednesday nights at 7 o'clock, same channel, and we'll be back with more CIMM sessions. Have a good evening.